Oeva Yeshua, Yeshua V'Rachamim.
Good morning, Shabbat Shalom. Welcome to Valley Beth Shalom. Everyone, hope you're having a lovely summer, and those who are visiting us, welcome. Hope you feel welcome here. We usually have a beautiful kiddush, kugel and tuna salad. Today it's a kiddush in virtual, so please imagine virtual kugel. Think of all the calories you're saving, but welcome, and we're so glad you're here and hope that you find this community welcoming and warm. And to everyone else, welcome. I'm sorry about the masks, but the County of LA instituted this mask mandate just yesterday, so we all have to go back to being bandits and wearing masks. Please close the blue prayer books. Take out the red volume of the Chumash. If you didn't get one, they're right here on the table. And the reading for this morning, Shabbat Chazon, is found on page 981. I want to say three things about this reading, three different levels that we can read this. We begin the fifth book of the Torah today, the fifth book of the Hebrew Bible, the book of Devarim. First, inside the book. Moshe has been with this people now for 38 years. He took them out of Egypt, crossed the Red Sea, brought them to Mount Sinai, experienced the presence of God, went up Mount Sinai to get the tablets, suffered the sin of the golden calf, came down the mountain, of course, schlepped them across the desert for almost 40 years, and now he's speaking not to his contemporaries, but to the children of those he brought out of the land of Israel. They're standing on the boundaries of the promised land, on the borders of the dream, and they're about to enter. And Moshe has one more thing to say to them. After all these years of teaching and cajoling and prophetic warning, one more thing to say, and that's what the whole book of Deuteronomy is. The whole book of Deuteronomy, the whole book of Devarim, is his last word, his ethical will to his people, because he knows he is soon to die, and he knows this is his last chance to address them. And he's worried, as any parent is worried when you send a kid out into the world and not knowing that you can't be there. The great paradox of being a parent is that you hold this child deeply in your heart, but you can't protect them 24 hours a day. You can't control their choices. And Moses in particular knows that when he goes away, they get in trouble. Because he remembers well what happened when he went up to the mountain for 40 days and he came down, and all of the commandments of loyalty and all of the words of affinity to God were dashed and at the sight of a golden calf. Their fear drove them to worship a golden calf, and he's worried that when he goes away and they enter the land and they're under the influence of all of the neighboring peoples, well, this is going to happen again. And so this word is offered with a certain kind of anxiety. You can feel the urgency, the tension in his words. Please. He warns them. He begs them. He teaches them. Don't depart from the ways that you've learned. Don't walk away from the teachings of the God who has taught you. Understand how important this is to you and to your future. That's the urgency of the book, and you can feel this. And if you've ever sent a kid away to summer camp, or you ever sent a child away to college, or you ever said goodbye to someone that you truly love and worry about them, then you can identify with the pathos, the deep feeling of this Torah portion. That's the first way to read it. Here's a second way to read it. Let's step out of the book for a moment. You ready? Middle of the 19th century, a little farmer in the north of Syria is farming his field with his ox-drawn plow, wooden plow, and the plow hits a big rock, and the plow breaks, and the little farmer begins to curse the gods, and he goes and he digs up the rock, and he notices that this very large stone has scratching on it. And he heard a rumor that the farmer next door found a similar rock and took it to the marketplace. And there were a bunch of Westerners, a bunch of archaeologists, whatever those are, and came and paid him a fortune for the rock. So he figures he'll take the rock to the market, he'll sell it to the Westerners, he'll buy himself a new plow. Sure enough, he does that. And several months later, a whole team of these guys show up and they offer to buy his field the whole field, for an enormous amount of money. He can't resist. He gives them the field, he takes the money, and this group of archaeologists from Yale University come into this place and they dig up his field. And what do they find in this field? Well, here's a quick lesson. The first written language in human history is created by the Sumerians, southern Mesopotamians, 5,000 years before the year zero. That's 2,000 years before the Torah is written. It's called cuneiform. You take a big block of mud and you let it dry in the sun. And just before it dries in the sun, you take a stick and you make marks on it. Not so much letters, but markings on it. And that is a document. When it dries, you have a document. The advantage of cuneiform documents, it's the first written language in human history, and it has a very good advantage. It lasts forever. Because it's clay, it will last forever. The disadvantage is it's hard to store such documents because they're big and heavy. And so the kings of the ancient kingdoms of Sumeria and Assyria and Babylon had a problem. They had files and files and files of documents and no place to put them. So they built a city. They built an entire city whose purpose was a filing cabinet for all of these things. And that's what the Yale University archaeologists found underneath that farmer's field. It was the great archive of the Babylonian Empire. And when they dug it up, and you can see this if you want to go, you go to Yale University, you go to the library, you get passed to go into the basement, and they'll show you what they found. They found everything. They found marriage agreements. They found lunch receipts. They found transactions for property. They found stories and myths. And one of the remarkable things they found was a whole treasury of treaties. The Babylonian emperor enters into treaties with all the lands surrounding his kingdom, all the lands that he conquered. They're called suzerainty treaties. That's a good word for your crossword puzzle tomorrow morning. And it means a treaty between a powerful emperor and a vassal state. And the suzerainty treaties between the great Babylonian emperor and all of the vassal states that served him, they all have the same format. They begin with a review of the relationship between the two states. All the good things that the king did for this state. I protected you from this enemy, and I fed you during this famine, and I helped you find water during this drought. And then it says, and in return, here's what you're going to do for me. You're going to pay me so much in taxes. You're going to send so many animals every year and so many bushels of apples and wheat. And in return, here's what I'm going to do for you. I'm going to protect you from enemies. I'm going to protect you from famine. And then at the end, it has a series of blessings and curses. Blessings if you obey this treaty, and curses if you don't obey this treaty. All of the suzerainty treaties of the Babylonian Empire had the same format, a literary structure. Turns out, rats. Turns out the book of Deuteronomy has the same structure. The book of Devarim has the same structure. Begins with a review of God's goodness to the people Israel, and then it continues to set out all of the obligations of Israel to God and the obligations of God to Israel, and it ends with a set of blessings and curses if you obey and if you disobey, and then how this treaty is to be recorded, and how this treaty is to be memorialized, and how this treaty is to be read each year. Now, what does that mean? It means that when the ancient Israelites wanted to describe their relationship to God, which is, after all, a very personal and a very abstract kind of thing, they seized upon a common literary format, something that was familiar to them, a way of expressing themselves that was familiar, and they chose this as a metaphor. God, as if God were an emperor and as if we were a vassal state. And they used the structure of the suzerainty treaty in order to describe the relationship between humanity, between the people Israel and God, with whom it has a covenant. The covenant becomes a treaty, or rather, treaty is a metaphor for this relationship. Now, you could use a different metaphor. And one of the interesting things to think about are the different metaphors that we used in Jewish life. And one of the metaphors that we use with Jewish life is a different one than this one. It's a metaphor of marriage. Think about a relationship to God as a marriage. The Torah is a ketubah. Mount Sinai is a chuppah, right? We have moments of closeness and moments of distance, like in every marriage. Responsibilities one to the other. And then there's a parent-child relationship. Avinu Shabbat Shamayim, our Father in heaven. The book of Deuteronomy chooses this one because it's the most directed in terms of the things you got to do, the behaviors that it mandates. And as you're reading the beginning of the book, you'll see it begins with this whole long list of Moses recounting to the people, here's how we got here. But what he's really doing is introducing, here are the obligations that will bind you coming forward. That's the second way to read it. All right, here's a third way to read it. You ready? Tonight begins Tisha B'Av. Tonight is the 9th day of Av. Tonight and tomorrow. 8 o'clock tonight. 6 o'clock is Minyan, if you'd like to come early. 8 o'clock we'll be doing some learning and reading the book of Eicha and commemorating Tisha B'Av. Tisha B'Av is a day on which the Jewish community, the Jewish world, gathers up all of the destructive events of our history, and there are lots of them, and sticks them all on one day. So that way we're not fasting every day of the year, because you could find something terrible that happened to Jews someplace every day of the year. You put them all on one day. That in itself is an interesting idea, right? Because the 9th day of Av may have been the day that the temple was destroyed the first time, and may have even been the day, ironically, the temple was destroyed the second time. But the 9th day of Av was not the day that all these other things happened. The reason why you put it all on one day is because this is always going to be a people that chooses life over death. We're not going to be a people that is solely focused on our destruction. And so by putting all of these commemorative events on one day, you allow the rest of the year to be a celebration of life. That's a big deal. But now here's the interesting part of the Torah reading. Ready? So you know that every week in synagogue we read a different portion of the Torah. The Torah is divided, the 5 books of Moses, divided into 54 sections. That gives you 52 weeks plus a couple of extra in case you have holidays. Every week you read a different section. We start in October with Simchas Torah. This year it's late September. And we read from Genesis through Exodus through Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. We get to the end, we roll the Torah back, and we start all over again. Everybody knows that, right? Now, it would have been better and wise if we would have coordinated the weekly reading with a cycle of yearly holidays, right? I mean, it would make some sense if we were really a smart people that the week you were celebrating Passover, you would arrive at the story of the Exodus from Egypt. Wouldn't that have made sense? Everybody say, we didn't do it that way. You read the Exodus from Egypt in January and February, you don't get to Pesach till April and March. By the time we get to Pesach, the weekly reading is way beyond the Exodus. Same thing with Shavuos. You think we get to Shavuos, holiday celebrating the giving of Torah, we ought to be reading the chapters in the Bible where God gives us the Torah. That would have made sense, right? No, we didn't do it that way. Because the two cycles aren't coordinated with each other. Anyone ever drive down Ventura Boulevard in a hurry? The traffic lights are not synchronized, right? If you're like me, you get stopped every 2 blocks with a traffic light. You think that somebody in the LA traffic department would be smart enough to synchronize the traffic lights so at 35 miles an hour, you could get from Encino to Woodland Hills in about 15 minutes so I can make dinner at Scott's house, but it don't work that way. They want you to stop at every corner. Why? Because they want you to stop and shop at every shopping center. That's why they did it that way. The Torah readings and the holiday readings are not coordinated. However, Jews are way too imaginative to let that one go. So what we do is we look for relationships between these two cycles. Look for relationships between these two cycles. So tonight is Tisha B'Av, and Tisha B'Av always falls out on the week you read Devarim. It always falls out here. And so the rabbis, the tradition, the imaginative minds and spirits of the Jewish tradition sort of put those two together, and they wondered, how is Tisha B'Av, the day that we commemorate the exile from our land, the destruction of our temple, the oppression that the Jews have suffered over the generations, how is that related to Moses' story that he's telling us? And the answer you'll see in a moment is that Moses is going to tell us the story about the trek through the desert. And the trek through the desert was a time of ordeal. It was a time of trial. It was a time of difficulty. It was a time when we were struggling among ourselves. And that is going to offer a sort of commentary on the experiences of destruction and oppression and exile that we suffered all these generations. It's as if all of Jewish history is itself a trek across the desert. But that means two things. One is that if all of Jewish history, which is punctuated by these moments of destruction and persecution and oppression, is a trek across the desert, its purpose is to teach us something, because that's why God put us in the desert anyway, to teach us to be godly people and free people and teach us how to build a just society and a sacred community. But more importantly, if the trek across the desert is the metaphor, the symbol for all of Jewish history, including all of its very sad moments, the trek across the desert ends up in the promised land. And that's what kept our people going through all the events of Tisha B'Av. That no matter how many times this people encountered suffering, persecution, oppression, destruction, and exile, there was always a deep, deep faith that one day we would make it to the promised land. We would make it to a place of freedom, a time of justice, a time of pride and not humiliation, and we would make it to the end of a journey, and the journey would bring redemption. And that's what connects this Torah portion, the last days in the Exodus, the last days in the desert, to the Tisha B'Av that will begin tonight. Tonight we'll begin Tisha B'Av, and we'll sing some sad songs, and we'll read the book of Eicha, the book of lamentation, the book of sadness in the Bible. But we always do it with this conviction in the back of our minds that exile, persecution, oppression, no matter how bitter it might be, is temporary. And that one day we will know redemption. And that's what kept the Jewish people moving. Those are three ways to read the Torah. I'll ask Yossi to come forward and begin reading for us. Those who are honored with aliyot, please make yourselves available to come on up.
We are in the Chumash, in the large book, on page 981. ויעזור ויגן ויושיע לכל החוסים בו ונאמר אמן. הכל עבודו התורה יעמוד. דוד בן יוסף ראשון במקום כהן, ברוך שנתן תורה לעמו ישראל בקדושתו, ואתם הדבקים באדוני אלוהיכם, חיים כולכם היום.
אדוני עמכם.
ברוך אדוני.
רבנן ברכו את אדוני המבורך.
ברוך אדוני המבורך לעולם ועד.
ברוך אדוני המבורך לעולם ועד. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם, אשר בחר בנו מכל העמים ונתן לנו את תורתו. ברוך אתה אדוני נותן התורה.
אמן. אמן אלה הדברים אשר דיבר משה אל כל ישראל בעבר הירדן במדבר בערבה מול סוף בין פרן ובין תופל לבן וחצרות ודי זהב 11 יום מחורב דרך הר שעיר עד קדש ברנע ויהי ב40 שנה ב-12 חודש באחד לחודש דיבר משה אל בני ישראל ככל אשר ציווה אדוני אותו עליהם.
אמת תורתנו הקדושה, ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם, אשר נתן לנו תורת אמת וחיי עולם נתח בתוכנו, ברוך אתה אדוני נותן התורה.
אמן. יעמוד סעיד בן פינוס לעלייה שנייה.
רבנן ברכו את אדוני עם המולך.
ברוך אדוני המלך לעולם ועד.
ברוך אשר ברא לנו מכל העמים ונתן לנו את תורתו וכתב עלינו נותן התורה.
אמן.
אמן. אחרי הכותו את סיחון מלך האמורי אשר יושב בחשבון ואת אוג מלך הבשן אשר יושב באשתרות באדראי בעבר הירדן בארץ מואב. הואיל משה באר את התורה הזאת לאמור, אדוני אלוהינו דיבר אלינו בחורב לאמור, רב לכם שבט בהר הזה, פנו וסעו לכם ובואו הר האמורי ואל כל שכניו בערבה והר ובשפלה ובנגב ובחוף הים, ארץ הכנעני והלבנון, עד הנהר הגדול, נהר פרת.
אמת תורתן תורך צור וכל אשר נתן לנו תורתן בית ויהיו לנו את תורתן וכתב עלינו נותן התורה.
I need the book. Get another book. I need the book. Third Aliyah. Aliyah number 3. No, she reads. יעמוד דוב בן משה שלישי.
ברכו את אדוני המבורך.
ברוך אדוני המבורך לעולם ועד.
ברוך אדוני המבורך לעולם ועד. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם, אשר ברוך בנו מכל העמים, ונתן לנו את תורתו. ברוך אתה אדוני נותן התורה.
אמן.
We find the Torah reading on page 983, verse 8.
אמן. ראה נתתי לפניכם את הארץ, בואו ורשו את הארץ אשר נשבע אדוני לאבותיכם, לאברהם, ליצחק וליעקב, לתת להם ולזרעם אחריהם, ואומר עליהם בעת ההיא לאמור, לא אוכל לבדי שאת אתכם, אדוני אלוהיכם הרבה אתכם, והנכם היום ככוכבי השמיים לרוב, אדוני אלוהי אבותיכם יוסף עליכם ככם 1000 פעמים, ויברך אתכם כאשר דיבר לכם.
ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם, אשר נתן לנו תורת אמת, וחיי עולם נטע בתוכנו. ברוך אתה אדוני נותן התורה.
Amen. The fourth Aliyah, number 4. יעמוד שמעון בן אריה ואלקל עלייה רביעית.
Baruch Adonai Hambarah.
ברוך אדוני המבורך לעולם ועד.
Baruch Adonai Hambarah Le'olam Va'ed. Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech Haolam Asher B'harbanu Mikol Ha'amim V'natan Lanu Et Torto. Baruch Atah Adonai Noten HaTorah.
אמן. איכה אשא לבדי תורככם ומסכם וריבכם, הבו לכם אנשים חכמים ונבונים וידועים לשבטיכם, בשימם בראשכם, ותענו אותי, ותאמרו, טוב הדבר אשר דיברת לעשות.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher natan lanu Torat emet v'hayeh olam natan b'tohenu Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
אמן. יעמוד
משה
משה
חיים,
חיים,
אהרון ואסתר.
אהרון ואסתר לעלייה חמישית.
ברכו אס אדוני המבורך.
ברוך אדוני המבורך לעולם ועד.
ברוך אדוני המבורך לעולם ועד. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם אשר בחר בנו מכל העמים ונתן לנו את תורתו. ברוך אתה אדוני נותן התורה.
אמן. ואקח את ראשי שבטיכם, אנשים חכמים וידועים, ויתן אותם ראשים עליכם, שרי אלפים ושרי מאות, ושרי 50 ושרי עשרות, ושוטרים לשבטיכם, ואצווה את שופטיכם בעת ההיא לאמור, שמוע בין אחיכם, ושפטתם צדק בין איש ובין אחיו ובין גרו, לא תכירו פנים במשפט. כקטון כגדול תשמעון, לא תגורו מפני איש, כי המשפט לאלוהים הוא, והדבר אשר יקשה מכם תקריבון אלי ושמעתיו.
ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם אשר נתן לנו תורת אמת וחיי עולם נטע בתוכנו. ברוך אתה אדוני נותן התורה.
אמן. יעמוד אברהם בן אוריאל לעלייה שישית. You find the Torah reading on page 985, verse 18. I did.
ברוך את אדוני המבורך. ברוך אדוני המבורך לעולם ועד. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם אשר בחר בנו מכל העמים ונתן לנו
את תורתו.
תורתו. ברוך אתה אדוני נותן התורה.
אמן. ואצווה אתכם בעת ההיא את כל הדברים אשר תעשון, ונישא מחורב ונלך את כל המדבר הגדול והנורא ההוא אשר ראיתם דרך הר האמורי, כאשר ציווה אדוני אלוהינו אותנו, ונבוא עד קדש ברנע, ואומר עליכם באתם עד הר האמורי, אשר אדוני אלוהינו נותן לנו. נותן אדוני אלוהיך לפניך את הארץ עולה עלי ראש, כאשר דיבר אדוני אלוהי אבותיך לך, אל תירא ואל תחת.
ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם אשר נתן לנו תורת אמת וחיי עולם. ברוך
נטע בתוכנו.
נותן התורה.
אמן.
אמן.
תעמוד. קראת יהודי דוב ושרה לעלייה השביעית. page 986, verse 27.
Baruch et Adonai Hamvorach.
It's 22.
Baruch Adonai Hamvorach leolam vaed. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. Asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim. V'natan lanu et Torato. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen. Vatikrevun elai kulchem. Vatomeru nishlecha anashim lefanenu. Vayechaveru lanu et haaretz. Vayashuvu otanu davar et haderech asher na'aleva. No, it's not the end. Asher na'aleva ba ve'et ha'erim asher na'aleh navo elo alehen. Tough verse. Vayitav be'enai hadavar vayekach mikem shenem asar anashim ish echad lashavet vayifnu vaya'alu hahara vayavou ad nahal eshkol vayareglu otah Vayikach be'adam mipri haaretz vayoridu el elenu vayashuvu otanu davar vayomeru tova haaretz asher Adonai Eloheinu noten lanu.
Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher natan lanu Torah emet v'chayei olam nata b'tochenu Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen. יתגדל ויתקדש שמי רבה בעלמא דברה חירותי וימליך מלכותי בחייכון וביומכון ובחיי דכל בית ישראל בעגלה
ובזמן קריב
ואמרו
אמן.
יהי שמי רבה מבורך לעולם מעולמיה יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל שמי דקודשה לילה מן כל ברכתה ושירתה תושבחתה ונחמתה תאמירן בימה ואמרו
אמן.
יעמוד דוד שלמה בן שאול פישל מפטיר חזק חזק. Conclusion of Parashat Dvarim is on page 998, verse 20.
Baruch et Adonai Hamvorach.
Baruch Adonai Hamvorach.
Baruch Adonai Hamvorach Leolam Va'ed. Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech Haolam Asher Bachar Banu Mikol Hamim V'natan Lanu Et Torato. Baruch Atah Adonai Noten HaTorah. Ad Asher Yaniach Adonai Lachechem Kachem Vayeshu Gamheim Et Haaretz Asher Adonai Elohechem Noten Lahem Be'ever HaYarden
Yeshavtem ish lirushato asher natati lachem v'et Yoshua tziviti va'etahi lemor einecha harot et kol asher asa Adonai Elohim l'shnei hamlachim ha'ele kein yaseh Adonai l'chol hamamlachot asher ata over asher ata over shama lo tira'um ki Adonai Elohim hu hinolachem lachem. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher natan lanu Torat emet v'chayei olam nata b'tocheinu. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Yamdu amagbiha v'hagolelek. Please rise as we lift the Torah and worship it. Vezot haTorah asher sam Moshe lifnei bnei.
David, give me this. Please be seated. In just a moment, we will begin the reading of the Haftarah, which you'll find on page 1000. David's going to read it for us. This Haftarah is the first chapter of the prophet Yeshayahu, and it begins with the words Chazon Yeshayahu, his vision. And so this is typically called in the tradition Shabbat Chazon. You guys okay? Good. Here's a quick background about this wonderful, wonderful prophecy. So the ancient Near East is shaped by two great empires. The Mesopotamian Empire, which is to the north and the east of us, and the Egyptian Empire, which is the south and the west of us. And of all the places in the world that God could have stuck us, God put us on the highway between these two empires. In other words, the most dangerous place in the ancient world. The advantage of being on that highway was that Israel was the beneficiary, the recipient of cultural influences from both sides. Abraham is a Mesopotamian, Moses is an Egyptian. We learned the best of both civilizations. But you're living between two great superpowers. And Israeli politics back then in the ancient world was a question of how you negotiate that relationship. For one brief moment, the two empires were in quiescence. They were both subdued. And that's why King David was able to rise, unite the tribes of Israel, and create a small empire. And his son Solomon created a little bigger empire and became a great trading power in the eastern Mediterranean. And the reason they could do this was because the Mesopotamians to the north and the Egyptians to the south were not powerful enough to make any influence on that part of the world. So we became, in the power vacuum, David rises, Solomon rises, and then the northern and southern kingdoms of Israel rise. But starting in the 8th century, Mesopotamia begins to grow. And the first great Mesopotamian empire of that era, the Assyrians, Ashur, capital in Nineveh, today the town of Mosul, starts to make noise about conquering the world. And the Egyptians are rising too and pushing back. And that's bad news if you live on the highway between the two empires, because we are going to be the battleground. And that is the background for this Haftarah. The two great empires are rising again. Now, think for a moment what issues this raises. First of all, there's a political issue, which is how do you survive if you're a small empire, a small country in a world of superpowers? How do you negotiate the relationship between which of the two superpowers do you ally yourself with? How do you protect yourself from the incursion of both sides? That's one problem. But in some ways, there's a deeper problem, which is a problem of personal identity. How do you interpret your own identity? If you believe yourself to be the chosen people of the God of the universe, and suddenly you are a third-rate political player in the world, you are marginal, you are nobody, You can't even control your own political destiny. How do you understand yourself as the chosen people of the God of the universe? And these two problems, the political problem and the identity problem, are exactly what the prophets are dealing with. Now, Isaiah is going to live 100 years before 150 years before the destruction is going to come. Jeremiah is the prophet we're going to read tonight in Eicha. Jeremiah is the prophet who witnessed the destruction. Isaiah is living 100 and 150 years before this. He's living at the time when the empires are rising. He lives in Jerusalem. He's watching all of this. And he's talking to his people about these two great issues. One way to read Isaiah is that he uses the covenant as a tool to interpret all of this. He sees the rise of empire not as an accident, but as an act of God. It's an act of God brought about to punish a sinful Israel. Now, in a certain way, this is deeply neurotic. Okay? It's deeply neurotic because the Assyrians are going to come anyway, whether Israel's righteous or not, and punish the Israelites. But as a tool of understanding ourselves, it puts us back in the middle of the universe. Why is this happening to us? Because we deserve it. Because we have not lived up to the strictures of our covenant. And that's what you're going to read that's what you're going to read as the pshat, the literal meaning of Isaiah's prophecy. He talks about a sinful Israel. Begins with a kind of lawsuit. It's called a reeve in prophetic world. He says, "Hear, O heavens, and give ear, O earth." So heaven and earth are the jury. For the Lord has spoken. God is going to bring a lawsuit against his people for their disloyalty. An animal knows its owner. A dog knows its master. But Israel doesn't seem to get it. They think that they control the conditions of their own existence, and they don't understand that God is the master of this world. God is the master of this covenant. And if you don't live up to the strictures of covenant, you don't get to long live on this land. That's the moral basis of the Isaiah prophecy. Now, if you wanted to step away from it for just a moment and ask yourself, did he really believe this? I mean, he's a wise man. Did he really understand this? Maybe there's another way to understand it. Slightly less religious, slightly more naturalistic or political. The prophet knows that we're living in a different world. We're no longer living in a world where we're in charge of everything. We're now going to have to negotiate our existence with these two superpowers. The only way to do that is to have a people that is deeply solidified, deeply unified. I have to say this and be too political about it, but a divided people cannot survive a crisis. Because a divided people attacked by a crisis is going to turn on each other. And that's going to be the destroying factor. So the question is, can we gather this people together into one unit, and one unity? Can we reinforce the moral solidarity of the people Israel so that whatever is going to come, whether it's going to be some sort of treaty with these great powers, or whether, God forbid, there's going to be a destruction and we go into exile, the only way we're going to survive in a world of superpowers who control the material conditions of our existence is to be spiritually authentic, to have integrity, to have a deep, deep sense of our identity. And that's what he's going to be talking about here. We have to reestablish, he says, and reinforce and restate who we are and what's important to us. Because that's the only way we're going to survive living in a world when others have all the material power and we have very little of it. And that's a prophetic idea which I still think rings very, very true. This is the Haftarah that introduces Tisha B'Av. It introduces the destruction that we're going to talk about tonight. You'll find it on page 1000. It is a brilliant Haftarah, and we'll ask David, who is our prophet in residence, to read Isaiah for us.
I chant this in memory of your husband and your father. Baruch Ata Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher bachar b'nviim tovim, v'ratza b'divreihem, hane'emarim be'emet. Baruch atah Adonai, habocher b'Torah, u'v'Moshe avdo, u'v'Yisrael amo, v'v'yei ha'emet. V'tzedek. Chazon Yeshayahu ben Emotz asher chazah al Yehuda v'Yerushalayim b'mei Uziyahu Yotam achaz Yechezkiyahu malchei Yehuda. Shemu shamayim v'azini eretz Ki Adonai diber panim gidalti v'romamti v'heim pashubi yadashor kohonehu v'chamor evus ba'alav Yisrael lo yada ami lo hitbonan hoy goy chotei Aham keder avon zera mereim bani mashchitim azvu et Adonai niatzu et kadosh Yisrael nazoru achor ametuku otosivu sarah kol rosh lechali v'chol evav dahavai Mikaf regel v'yad rosh ein bo mitom et savachabura umakatria lo zoru v'lo chubashu v'lo rucha bahashamen artzachem shmama arechem srufot eish admatchem v'negdechem zarim ochlim otah Ushmama kma pechat zarim vidnot rabat Zion kisuka bacharem kimluna b'miksha ke'ir nitzura lulei Adonai tzvaot hotir lanu sarit kimat kistom hayinu Lamora daminu Shemu dvar Adonai kitzine sidom Azinu Torat Eloheinu Am Amora Lama livros ivchehem Yomar Adonai Savati Olotelim b'chelev merim V'dam parihim uchvasim Biatudihim lo chafatzti Ki tavou leiraot panai mi bikesot mi etchem remos chatzerai lo tosifu havi min chatshav ketoret toeva hi li chodesh v'shabbat kero mikra lo chalaven v'yatzara Chachechem u'moadechem sana nafshi hayu alai la torach nileti nehiso v'farischem kapechem alim einai mikem gam ki tarbut fila eineni shomeya yedechem damim maleu Rachatzu hizaku hasiru roam alochem mineged einai chidlu hareya limdu hetev dirshu mishpat ashru chamotz shiftu yatom rivu almanah Nuchavenevacha yomar Adonai Im yiyu chatrechem kashanim kashelek yalbinu Im yadimu katola katsemer yiyu Im tovu ushmatem tov haaret tochelu Anu umritem cheref tuklu ki pi Adonai diber. Eicha haitalezona kirya nemana mileti mishpat tzedek yalim ba v'yatamiratzchim kaspech hayalasikim savech mahul bamayim sarayich sorerim v'chavrei ganavim kulo ohev shochad v'rodev shalmonim yatom lo yishpotu v'riv almana lo yavo aleihem lachein ne'um ha'adon Adonai tzvaot avir Yisrael Hay enachem mitzarai v'nakma me'oivai v'yashiv yadi alayich v'yetzrov kabor sigahoyich v'yasira kol bibliyayich v'yashiva shavtayich kivari shona v'yatzayich kivatchila acharechein yikarei lach ir hatzedek Kirya nemana Tzion b'mishpati padeh v'shaveha b'tzedaka Baruch Ata Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam tzur kol alamim tzadik b'chol adorot ha'elan ne'eman ha'omer v'yoseh ha'medaber u'mekayim shekal devarav emet v'tzedek Ne'eman atahu Adonai Eloheinu v'ne'emanim devarecha v'davarechad midvarecha achor lo yashuv reikam ki el-melech ne'eman v'rachaman ata baruch ata Adonai ha'el ha'ne'eman b'chol devarav Rachem al Tzion ki beit chayenu v'la'uvat nefesh toshia b'mheira v'yameinu baruch ata Adonai Misamech Tzion bivaneha Samcheinu Adonai Eloheinu B'Eliyahu Hanavi Avdecha Malchut Beit David Mishichecha B'mheira Yavo V'Yageli Beinu Al Kiso Lo Yeshev Zar V'Lo Yinchalu Od Acherim Et Kvodo Ki V'Shem Chashecha Lishbata Lo Shelo Yichbenei Ro Li'olam Va'ed Baruch Ata Adonai Magen David Al ha-Torah, v'al ha-Avodah, v'al ha-Nevi'im, v'al Yom ha-Shabbat hazeh, shenatata lanu Adonai Eloheinu, l'kedusha v'le'milcha, l'chavod u'l'tifaret, al hakol Adonai Eloheinu, anachnu modim lach, m'varchim otach, yitbarach shemcha b'fi kol chai, tamid li'olam va'ed, baruch ata Adonai, mikadesh ha-Shabbat. It's going to keep going. Rabbi, thank you.
Two more things about this Haftarah, which you listened to in David's wonderful reading. First, that this Haftarah requires an act of liturgical gymnastics because it's read in two different tropes. Half of the Haftarah, which is all of the positive stuff, is read in the regular Haftarah trope. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. The other half of the Haftarah, the castigation part, the blaming part, is read in the Eicha trope, the trope that we'll read tonight for the Book of Lamentation. Eicha yashva badad, ha'ira batiyam hayta lehemas. And David does this beautifully, and to switch back and forth is really, really hard. So thank you, and Yasher Koch, really beautifully done. The other little thing about this Haftarah, if you gave away the book, so I'll read it to you. The last line of the Haftarah, Sion b'mishpat tifadeh. Anyone ever hear of a fraternity called ZBT? Right? That's where it comes from. Sion, Zion, b'mishpat tifadeh. Injustice will be redeemed. ZBT. That's where it comes from. Now, there you can impress your friends and family tonight. At some trivia context. There you go. Anyway, shishkoch. And then Cantor Fox has a beautiful joke, which he'll tell much better than me, about a cantor you saw this, right? A cantor was doing a wedding once, and the mother-in-law was, shall we say, a difficult person. And when he got to the end of the Sheva Brachot, it was Baruch Atah Adonai, Misameach Hatan V'Kala. Back to Echatrum. We want to take a moment now for two special prayers. A prayer for friends and family who are ill, who are in hospital or are suffering this Shabbos. If there's someone close to you, then gather their presence into your thoughts. Hold them close. Yishaberach Avotenu Avram Yitzchak v'Yaakov Sarivka Rachav Aleah. Hu yivarech v'yarped kol hacholim b'kilatenu akdosha. May you, who blessed our ancestors at the sea and in the desert, bless all our ill friends through us, your witnesses. Grant that they know in this holy community there are men, women, and children who pray for the skill of the physician, for their wholeness of body and strength of spirit. Teach us always to remember your words from the void and the vastness of the darkness. Let there be light, and let us pray all together. Amen. If you happen to have a prayer book, page 149, we offer a prayer on behalf of our friends and family, our community and brothers and sisters in the land of Israel. Avinu Shebashamayim Tzur Yisrael v'Goalo Barech and Medinat Yisrael Reshit Smichat Gulatenu. Hagen aleh bevrat chazdecha afros aleh sukat shlomecha ushlach orcha v'amitcha l'roshecha sarecha v'yotzecha v'taknein b'yetza tova milfanecha v'chazek et yedei miginei eretz kodshenu v'anchilimin alhenu Yeshua v'yateret nitzachom tadrein v'natata shalom ba'aretz v'simchat olam liyoshvecha v'nomar amen. Avinu Shebashamayim, rock and redeemer of the people Israel, bless the state of Israel with its promise of redemption. Shield it with your love, spread over it the shelter of your peace, guide its leaders and advisors with your light and your truth. Help them with your good counsel. Strengthen the hands of those who defend our holy land, deliver them, crown their efforts with triumph. Bless the land with peace and its inhabitants with lasting joy. And let us pray together. Amen. Page 151. Ashrei Yoshev Eisecha Od Yahallelu Chasalam.
Ve'ilad Adonai Yedaber Pi Yivarech Kol Basar Shem Kodsho Leolam Evahed V'anachnu Nevarechiach Me'ata ve'ad olam Hallelujah. Hallelujah. Et Hashem Adonai Ki nizgov Shemo levado Hoedo al eretz V'shamayim Vayarem keren liyamo Teila lechol Chasidav Livnei Yisrael Am Keravo Hallelujah Hallelujah Mizmor LeDavid Havuladonai Benelim Havuladonai Kavod Vaos Havuladonai Kivod Shivod Ishtachavuladonai Be'adrat Kodesh Kol Adonai El Mayim El HaKavod Yirim Adonai El Mayim Rabim Kol Adonai Ba'koach Kol Adonai Be'adar Kol Adonai Shover Arazim Vayshaber Adonai Edar Zehar Vanon Vayarkideim Kimo Egel Vanon V'Sivyon Kimo Van Revim Kol Adonai Chotsev Lavodeish Kol Adonai Yachir Mirmar Yachil Adonai Mireba Var Kadesh Kol Adonai Yechol Elayalot Vayachzu Yarot וביחנו כולו אומר כבוד, אדוני למה ולישב, וישב אדוני מלך לעולם, אדוני הוס לעמו ייתן, אדוני יברך את עמו בשלום, ובנוחו יאמר את חיימי, למה חזיך ימבה את עומחיה ויושר ירחם דרכנו וכל נתיבותיה שלום אשיבנו אליך ונשובה חדש ימינו חדש ימינו We begin Musaf on page 155. Chatzi Kaddish, then 156b, followed by the Kiddush. ידגלה שמי רבה למדי ברכרותי וימליך מלכותי בחייכון וביומכון ובחיי לכל בית ישראל והגלה ובזמן קורי וימרו אמן יהי שמי משתבר מדבר בדרום הנשיא ודבר ודלה ודלה שמי קודשה בריחו לאלו מן כל מלכתה ושירתה תושבחתה ונחמתה תמירן ביולמה וימרו ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו ואלוהי אבותינו אלוהי אברהם אלוהי יצחק ואלוהי יעקב אלוהי שרה אלוהי רבקה אלוהי רחל ואלוהי לאה האל הגדול הגיבור והנורא אל העליון גומל חסדים וטובים וקונה הכל וזוכר חסדי אבות ומביא גואל לבני בניהם למען שבו ויהבה מלך עוזר ומושיע ומגן ברוך אתה אדוני מגן אברהם ופוקד שרה אתה גיבור לעולם אדוני מחי מתים אתה רב להושיע מכלכל חיים בחסד ונופלים ורופא חולים ומאדיר אסורים ומקיים אמונתו אל ישעי עפר מי כמוך ומי לא מלך מלך במיתו חיי מיך כמוך בגבורות ומידו מלך ממית ומחיה ומצמיח ישועה ונאמן אתה להחיות מתים ברוך אתה אדוני מחיי המתים נעריצך ונקדישך כסוד שיח שרפי קודש המקדישים שמך בקודש ככתוב על יד נביאך וקרא זה אל זה ויאמר קדוש 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 lay 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 Sharitav shoalim shoalim zelazeh Oye mekom mekom kevolah leyu matav baruch Yom Meiru, lay lay lay. Lay lay lay, lay lay lay. Baruch kevod Adonai mimekomo. Komo yifer verachamim v'yachon ham yachadim shemo erev avoker בכל יום תמיד ערב הבוקר בכל יום תמיד ערב הבוקר ערב הבוקר בכל יום Amayim Yava Shema Amerim Shema Eloheinu, Hu Avinu, Malkeinu, Moshiach, Ve'hu Yashmienu, Berachamav, Sheinit Le'yenei Kolechoi, Liot Lachem Le'Elohim, Ani Adonai Elohechem, Udivrei Choshicha Katuv Le'mor, Imloch Adonai Le'olam. לדור ודור, לדור ודור, לדור ודור נגיד גודלך, ולנצח נצחים, ולנצח נצחים, קדושתך נקדיש לדור ודור. נגיד גודלך, ולנצח נצחים, ולנצח נצחים, קדושתך נקדיש. ושבחך אלוהינו מפינו לא ימוש לעולם ועד. כי למלך גדול, כי למלך גדול וקדוש אתה לדור ודור, לדור ודור. ולנצח נצחים, ולנצח נצחים, קדושתך. כי אל מלך גדול וקדוש אתה, ברוך אתה אדוני
You may conclude the Amidah on your own pace. If you finish, you may be seated. Kaddish Shalem, page 181.
יגלה בגלה שמאיר רבה ועול למדי ולגונדי וימליך מלכותי בחייכנו וימיכנו חייכו בישראל וגלהו זמן קוריו ימרו אמן יהי שמי רבה מבורך לעולם ולעולמי ולמיה ידברך וידבח וידבר מדרמן הזה וידבר ביטל ביטל שמיר קודשו בריחלילה מקוברת ושאלת ובחד ורמתון מיום יום ומרו אמן תתקע ולצלותון ובאותון לכל ישראל קוראים שמיים ומרו אמן הישלם הרב ומן שמיים וחיים עלינו ועל כל ישראל ומרו אמן עושה שלום ורב יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל וימרו Amen. Ein Keloheinu, ein Kadoneinu, ein Kemalkeinu, ein Kemoshienu, mich Eloheinu, mich Adoneinu, mich Malkeinu, mich Moshienu, no del Eloheinu, no del Adoneinu, no del Malkeinu, no del Moshienu, Baruch Eloheinu, Baruch Adoneinu, Baruch Malkeinu, Baruch Moshienu, Tau Eloheinu, Tau Adoneinu, Tau Malkeinu, Tau Moshienu, Tau Sheiktiru, Tau Hoteinu, לפניך את גדורת הסמים.
עלינו לשבח, page 183, together.
עלינו לשבח לאדון הכל, לתת גדולה ליוצר בראשית, שלא עשנו כגויי ארצות, ולא שמנו כמזבחות אדמה, שלא שם חלקנו כעם, וגורלנו ככל עמונם, ואנחנו גואלים ומשתחווים ומודים לפני מלך מלכי המלכים הקדוש ברוך הוא, שהוא נוטה שמיים ויוסד הארץ, ומשה מקורו בשמיים ימהר, שכינתו זו ושכינתו זו וגולבי ורובים, הוא אלוהינו אמת מלכנו וזולתו, ככתוב בתורתו, וידעתו היום וישיבותה אל לבבך, כי אדוני הוא האלוהים בשמיים ממעל ועל הארץ ועל הארץ ביתחד אינו יכיר וידעו כפרת ככתוב בתורתך אדוני מלך לעולם יבואד ונאמר והיה אדוני למלך על כל הארץ היום ההוא יהיה אדוני אחד ושמו echad.
Words of Kaddish are found on page 184. We invite all of those who recite Kaddish, memory of loved ones, observance of Yartzeit, to join us, please. Page 184. Yitkadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabbah.
Amen.
V'yalma divrach birutei v'yamlich malchutei v'chayechon v'yamechon uv'chayei dechal Beit Yisrael v'agalau v'zman kariv v'yamru Amen. Yehei shmei Rabbah mevarach le'olam me'olmaya yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitramam v'yitnaseh v'yithadar v'yitalev v'yithalal shemei dekudsha brichu le'elam min kol birchata v'shirata tushbechata v'nechamata damiran be'alma v'yimru Amen. Yehei shlama Rabbah min Shemaya v'chayim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'yimru Amen. Oseh shalom b'mromav uyaseh shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'yimru Amen. Yeshkoch, please be seated. Thank you to those who led services this morning, to Cantor Fox for his wonderful davening, for Yossi Dresner for all of his guidance and for reading Torah, to Toby and to Diane for reading Torah for us this morning as well, and to David for reading the Haftarah. Thank you, David. And to Ron Ryder, our wonderful Gabbai, and I think Jack was the Mekabel Panim this morning. So thank you so very much, everyone who served the congregation this morning, and welcome to everyone in Shabbat Shalom. Hope that you are taking very good care and doing well. A reminder that tonight is Tisha B'Av. There's Minyan at 6 o'clock with Yossi right back here or online, and he'll be doing Mincha Mariv, and he'll be doing Eicha, reading the Book of Lamentation. At 8 o'clock, we're gathering together as a community. We're going to be including the friends from Adat Ariel and Stephen S. Wise Temple. And I want to welcome Rabbi Woznicka, who's with us this morning. David, it's a pleasure to have you here. And we'll be learning together with their rabbis for about an hour or so, praying the Mariv prayers and then reading Eicha, again, both in Hebrew and in English. So you're all welcome to come back. It's very informal. Come comfortable. Sit on the floor, on a chair, however you like to do it, and we'll share the book of Eicha. Tomorrow morning, because it's Tisha B'Av, yes, Minyan at 8:30, and then again in the afternoon at 2 o'clock. both in person and online. The 2 o'clock mincha includes the Torah and Haftarah so that people can put their tefillin back on. And then in the evening, there'll be mincha mariv again, or mariv again, with Cantor Toby in the evening. All week, minyan in the morning at 7:30, minyan in the evening at 6, on Shabbos, of course, at 6 o'clock. I'm going to be going for a little vacation. Rabbi Farkas is apparently coming back tomorrow, we hope, and he'll be taking over, and I'll be seeing all of you very soon. Tonight is Tisha B'Av, and the question of Tisha B'Av that we'll be talking about tonight is a very, very, to me, the interesting question for this moment in our history. In the ancient world and into modernity, a people is defined by its connection to its land, its language, its culture, its custom, its way of life, its narrative, its literature. Take some of those away, and a people collapses, it implodes. That was the theory on which the ancient empires of Assyria and Babylon, when they conquered Israel, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, took away the leaders back to the imperial capital. The leaders of the northern kingdom taken to the imperial capital of Nineveh, and they disappeared. And that's what we call the 10 lost tribes. They didn't get lost, and they're not in Utah. They assimilated into the empire, because separated from their land, separated from their status as a cultural majority, separated from their language, within a generation they assimilated into the larger populace of the Assyrian Empire. The Babylonians came in 586 and destroyed the temple, and also took the leaders away and settled them by the waters of Babylon. And as the Psalm says in Psalm 137, by the waters of Babylon we sat and we wept. How can we sing a song of Zion on foreign soil? How are we supposed to survive in a place where we are a minority, where no one speaks our language, no one knows our custom, we don't have a temple in which to worship? By every stretch of sociological imagination, we should have died when the temples were destroyed. The first time in 586 and the second time in the year 70. That's what happens to people who lose their land, lose their cultural majority, lose their language, lose their way in the world. And by the way, not just then, now too. The Chinese have done this to Tibet. They exiled the Tibetan leadership. They settled a foreign group of mercenaries in Tibet, and you see cultural genocide going on in Tibet. I told you a story before. My daughter is a clinical psychologist working in Phoenix, Arizona, and the clinic she works for has a contract with the federal government to provide mental health services to the Navajo Nation. The Navajo Nation has been in exile for 130, 140 years. They were dispossessed of their land, moved off of their land, put into reservations, humiliated, their family structures and cultural structures taken away, children taken and put into schools where their language was forbidden. And the incidences of domestic abuse, alcohol and drug abuse, broken lives in the Navajo Nation is quite astronomical, and that's what my daughter does. She tries to help these people. That's what happens to people who are in exile. But for some reason, it didn't happen to us. And the question is why and how? How was it that a people taken from their land, resettled in a place where they don't speak the language, where the culture is not the same, as a small cultural minority, how was it that we managed to survive? I mean, in a certain way, to me, the most important day is not the 9th day of Av, the day of destruction. It's the 10th day of Av. It's what we did next. How was it? I mean, one of the ironies is that the person who notices this first is Haman. Because Haman says to Ahasuerus, there's a certain people who live in the land who are not like the rest of us. Now, first of all, that's interesting because we wrote that book, so we would put into the mouth of the guy who hates us, and with all of his fear attached to it, the wonder of the fact that we survived. The book of Esther, the Megillat Esther, is a book of diaspora. What does diaspora mean? It means you're not living where you should be living. You're far away from your native land. You're alienated. And yet, Haman says, they persist. they live, they thrive. How do you understand that? So tonight, I've asked the rabbis, I've asked Rabbi Brian Schuldenfrei of Adat Ariel and Rabbi Sari Laufer of Stephen Weiss, and the three of us are going to discuss this tonight and bring some of the text, some of the written work that I think demonstrates this remarkable cultural resilience, power to reinvent ourselves and to find a way to live in diaspora, to find a way to make the day after a day of creation and not a day of destruction. And that's what we're going to be talking tonight at Tisha B'Av. How did we find our way in the world separated from all of the evidence of our identity? And now that we have returned to the land of Israel, what do we know now from this long, long journey in diaspora that we need to understand most? That's what tonight's conversation will be about. We'll begin around 8 o'clock. Everyone is welcome. And it's Tisha B'Av, so I can't serve you refreshments. We'll just keep that in mind. So, Kiddush, Samuel, you making Kiddush for us? Come on, everyone rise, please. If you're next to someone who you trust, put your arms around them. Shabbat Shalom, Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat, 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 Shabbat Shalom. Hoi, Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat, 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 Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat, 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 Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat, 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 Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat, 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 Shamru.
V'shamru v'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat, v'asot et ha-Shabbat, v'dorotam v'ritolam, beini uvein b'nei Yisrael, oti le'olam, Ki sheshet yamim asa Adonai et hashamayim ve'et haaretz uvayom hashvi'i shavat vayi nafash al ken berach Adonai et yom hashabat vayi kadshehu savri rabotai Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei peri hagafen.
אדון עולם אשר מלך בטרם כל יציר נברא ויתנסה בחרצו כל אזי מלך אזי מלך שמו נקרא ואחרי ככלות הכל לבדו ימלוך נורא והוא היה והוא הווה והוא יהיה בתפארה והוא אחד ואין שני להמשילו להכבירה בלי ראשית בלי תכלית ולא העוז והמשרה והוא אלי וחי גואלי וצור חבלי ביצרה והוא ניסי ומנוס לי מנת כוסי ויום אקרא בידו אבקיד רוחי והייתי שן ואיילה וימרוחי גביעתי אדוני לי ולא ירא שבת שלום